troops to fight in Ukraine.
No, the only U.S. Military personnel that are in Ukraine are associated with the embassy as part of the Defense Attaché office, and they're doing important work in terms of helping us with the accountability of weapons and systems that are provided to Ukraine. The president's been clear there's not going to be U.S. troops on the ground in Ukraine.
NATO allies like Germany, UK, Italy also said there is no change to the agreed position that no European country or NATO member state will send troops to Ukraine. The NATO chief has also denied considering sending troops to Ukraine. However, Stoltenberg insisted that the military alliance will continue to support Ukraine. The Kremlin also warned that conflict between Russia and the US-led NATO military alliance would become inevitable if European members of NATO troops fight in Ukraine. Earlier, Macron hinted at the possibility of sending troops to Ukraine, this after a meeting with the European leaders in Paris that aimed to send Moscow a strong message of Western resolve over support for Kyiv. The leaders in Paris discussed the formation of a new coalition to supply Ukraine with missiles and bombs of medium and long range.
La priorité des priorités est la question des munitions.
Everything was discussed in a free and direct manner tonight. There was no consensus today to send troops onto the ground in a manner that's official, assumed and endorsed. But on the dynamic, nothing should be excluded. We will do everything so that Russia cannot win this war.
Aller au bout des stocks qui sont encore disponibles, à identifier les pays.
Meanwhile, in Washington, U.S. President Joe Biden held one of the most intense meetings in the Oval Office. Well, that's, of course, according to the Senate Democratic Majority Leader Chuck Schumer. This meeting was over the crucial Ukraine aid that is facing an uphill task in the U.S. Congress. Biden has urged the lawmakers to approve the $95 billion package, which includes $60 billion for Ukraine. On the other hand, while diplomacy talks are on, Ukraine is losing more territory on the battlefield. In the latest, Ukraine's military said that its forces have withdrawn from 2 more villages near the eastern town of Avdiivka. However, Ukraine says Russia witnessed significant losses in the fight for these villages. Earlier this month, Russian forces captured the strategic town of Avdiivka.
Recently, French President Emmanuel Macron hinted at the possibility of sending troops to Ukraine at a meeting of European leaders. Though he did say that there was no consensus on it, these comments did not bode well for Macron. Russia was quick to respond. To this, the Kremlin said that conflict between Russia and the US-led NATO military alliance would become inevitable if European members of NATO troops fight in Ukraine. NATO members too have assured that there is no change in the agreed position, with NATO chief Jens Stoltenberg denying considering sending troops to Ukraine. While diplomacy on this front continues, on ground Ukraine is losing more territory on the battlefield. In the latest, Ukraine's military said that its forces have withdrawn from 2 more villages near the eastern town of Avdiivka. My name is Hem Kaur Soroy, and to discuss the divergent positions on the war in Ukraine and to understand how things will pan out in the 3rd year of this war, we're now being joined by Ambassador Volker Stanzel, former German ambassador to China and Japan, senior distinguished fellow at SWP, German Institute for International and Security Affairs. Sir, thank you so much for joining us.
Pleased to be here.
Now, sir, to begin with, Macron's comments have drawn the ire of not just the Kremlin, but it has also led to sharp responses from NATO allies. Why do you think these comments caused such panic?
Well, NATO had agreed before to avoid everything that would lead to a war between NATO countries and Russia. And sending troops to Ukraine, of course, entails the danger that it would come to direct combat between NATO troops and Russian troops, and that would lead to an escalation, might very well lead to an escalation that we want to avoid. Now, about this remark by Macron, of course, he added later that he does not intend to send combat troops, but that might be necessary to train Ukrainian troops on the ground in Ukraine. Still, the symbolic value of doing that is just great, as the Kremlin's reaction has shown and as the reaction from other Europeans has shown, not the least the German Chancellor Scholz himself, who has right away said this is out of the question.
Right. Now, of course, we've heard the statement from the Kremlin, which sees this as an all-out breach in a direct conflict between NATO and Russia. What's your take on that?
Well, of course, Russia has threatened even nuclear arms in the beginning. And of course, threaten as much as possible is a strategy. Certainly, Putin does not expect the whole of NATO to go into combat with Russia, nor does he, I think, even imagine to go into an all-out war, because Russia, as we have seen over the past 2 years, does not have such a strong army. They have nuclear arms, that is true. But go into an all-out war is something entirely different. What Putin, I think, has gained from the remarks by Macron is the realization that Europe is much less unified than even he might have hoped, because Macron going right away against the attitude of other NATO countries and especially other EU countries, and then mainly, of course, against the German attitude, is something that he must have dreamed of in his best dreams. And he must enjoy himself enormously, I'm afraid.
All right, you're absolutely right. This has revealed the divergences within the alliance as well. NATO's limitations, in fact, have been highlighted through the course of this war. Its support for Ukraine that's fallen short, especially with Ukraine having to cede more territory in the east, in the latest, that is. What's your assessment of the role of the international community here?
The role of the international community, well, many countries have tried to suggest how to come to peace and how to start negotiations, not the least the BRICS countries, of which India, of course, is a partner. But so far, this has always run into opposition by Russia. Medvedev, just not even a week ago, has repeated the original Russian demands, and he has said we must occupy Kyiv in order to come to peace. So there is no real basis to come to negotiations. What could happen is if you have other countries beside Western countries, I mean the G7 and NATO, other countries exerting much more pressure on Russia. I mean, India, of course, I mean, China, of course, I mean, Lula in Brazil, of course, that might have an effect on Putin. But as long as he feels he's on a long road maybe, but still on the road to victory, I think he will not be ready to seriously negotiate peace.
Right, now, let's talk about the key ally here, that is the United States. Joe Biden has been trying to drum up support to get more aid to Ukraine. He also highlighted the dire consequences of not approving the aid bill. Do you think the West can get adequate aid to Ukraine to help in its fight?
Well, it could. And something I think is missing is a declaration by the EU or European countries or non-US NATO members to make up for the 60 billion that we're waiting for from Congress. It seems it takes longer and longer. This does great damage to Ukraine. It means people are dying in Ukraine because they cannot sufficiently defend themselves. So it would be an enormously strong gesture if others picked up the tab that the US is not ready to pay at this moment.
All right. Now, of course, with Russia making advances in the east, how do you think Ukraine is positioned at the moment? What are the prospects in the third year of Russia's full-scale invasion of Ukraine?
Well, I'm sorry, I'm not a military expert, and it's very hard to fathom what is actually happening on the ground. We see Russia's troops are making headway, very slow, but they do. They pay a high price in blood for these victories, while Ukraine is very, very careful in deploying too many people to the risk of being killed. They just don't have that many. And they run out of ammunition. That is also obvious to see. But what strategy is being discussed in Kyiv? What strategy is being discussed between Ukraine and NATO allies, not the least the United States? This I don't know, and it is very difficult to imagine as an observer how this could be turned around. All
right. Well, Ambassador Volker Stanzel, thank you so much for joining us on WION World is One with your insights and perspective on this.
You're very welcome. Thank you.
Ukraine needs $3 billion in financial aid per month to survive the war with Russia in 2024. Now, this was shared by the Ukrainian finance minister. What are Ukraine's options? Till now, Ukraine has received more than $73 billion in financial aid from its Western partners, but now the inflow of funds and weapons has slowed down. I'm Shivan Channa for WION World is One. To talk more on this, we have with us Dr. Gilbert Doctorow, international affairs analyst, author and historian, joining us live from Brussels. Doctor, I want to get to it directly. Welcome to WION. What are Ukraine's options going forward, the way things stand as of now?
Well, Mr. Zelensky has been the salesman of Ukraine for much of the last 2 years in his dealings, first with the United States, also with Germany and other European powers. And he has done his very best to turn the taps on and to receive both financial and military aid from the Western countries. However, it looks like the game is up. The United States, the appropriations bill that Mr. Biden has been pushing very hard, which would provide for $60 billion in new assistance to Ukraine, is blocked in the House of Representatives and is very unlikely to come to a vote anytime soon. In this situation, it is the Europeans who have been invited by the states to fill in the void, and that is an impossible void to fill. Even the recent $50 billion that was approved after great internal negotiations in the EU is for 5 years. So to figure it out, that's $10 billion a year. It falls way short of what Mr. Zelensky says he needs to maintain his budget.
Dr. Doctorow, when you say the game is up, do you feel this is where Ukraine just needs to surrender now? They are left with no other options?
Well, what we're talking about is a peculiar country. By all objective standards, Ukraine is the walking dead. The $3 billion a month or euros a month that Mr. Zelensky and his colleagues say they need is to pay the pensions, is to pay the salaries of government employees. That's to say, for the government to function. Where is that money? Why is Ukraine so dependent on this life support for its basic government functions? Because basically it is dead. The only thing that's missing is a death certificate. And I believe that will be issued in the next few months when there is not sufficient funds to keep the government going. You can imagine that the tranquility within Ukraine is maintained precisely because people receive their pensions and receive their salaries. When this stops happening, there will be the necessary political reaction against a failed government and a failed state.
Doctor, now Zelensky was recently also in Saudi Arabia to push for peace talks with Russia. Now, the kingdom is keen on resolving the conflict, but can MBS, Mohammed bin Salman, can he convince Putin to exit Ukraine? And what role can Saudi Arabia play here, given the fact that they gave Putin a hero's welcome just a few months ago?
Well, I think you're asking MBS to square the circle. It just doesn't work. And that is to say that it is impossible for him to move Mr. Putin to a capitulation, because when you look at what the peace plan is of Mr. Zelensky and his immediate associates, it amounts to a Russian capitulation. Why would you capitulate if you're just about winning the war? And if that winning hand is being recognized by your enemies today, the United States, Western European military analysts are not doing Russia any favor in recognizing that it is now broken the deadlock and is advancing daily against the long-held positions of the Ukrainian armies.
Doctor, now, as far as the things that were revealed in the media, Zelensky went there to push for peace talks. He met MBS to try to convince Putin to back off. Now, my question is, do you feel there was something more in that meeting, which of course has not seen the light of day yet, because it's very likely for Zelensky to go and ask for funds? Do you feel Ukraine, or do you feel Zelensky made that kind of a request from Saudi Arabia as well? And do you think Saudi Arabia would help monetarily, because it very well can?
Well, Saudi Arabia has a very balanced policy and does not want to appear to be in anybody's pocket, meaning that it has a long tradition of being a close ally of the United States in the Middle East. And more recently, it has been an economic ally of Russia in managing the global oil markets. So it's a balanced position. And I think that for the Saudis, it was as much a public relations exercise receiving Zelensky as it was a PR exercise for Zelensky in approaching Saudi Arabia and to make the appearance of seeking peace, which he is not seeking.
So you don't see it as anything more than a PR exercise for both nations. Okay, Doctor, I want to move on to the next aspect of this. I want to focus on France next. I want to get your thoughts on it. The French President Macron's recent remarks that suggested the possibility of sending troops to Ukraine. He said he's not going to rule it out. And that made headlines across the world. Soon there was a response from the Russians, and one by one we saw all the major NATO heavyweights distancing themselves from Macron's comment. What does this highlight about the West's stance on Ukraine and their basic principle of one for all and all for one, which pretty much fell apart like a house of cards?
Well, the one for all and all for one took a big hit several weeks ago when Donald Trump said that he would not stand by NATO allies who did not fund properly NATO's military budgets. Now, that was a hit several weeks ago. Within the European Union, I think the storming of Avdiivka by the Russians, a stronghold that was built up over 9 years by the Ukrainians with Western assistance, that change in the situation on the ground in the battlefield had an impact on the world at large and at Europe in particular. It made it clear that there is nothing untakeable for the Russian armies, that they are very, very skilled. It's not just a question of a 10-to-1 ratio in favor of Russians in artillery shells. It is the fact of superior strategy and also strategic and tactical military leadership. The storming of Avdiivka was by the technique that goes back several thousand years, but was updated by the Russians. I mean, it is the technique of the Trojan horse. They entered the city by 1.5 or 1.2 meter wide pipe for sending a brigade through 3 kilometers. That kind of military expertise and inventiveness, I think, had a big impact on the thinking of European military leaders that Russia is a formidable military force, something which they have been denying for the last decade. As we all know, until recently, it was China, China, China. And the Russians were considered to be just minor players in the military arena. One thought back of how they were lying on their back in the 1990s, how their military collapsed. Well, those days are long gone. And finally, it has penetrated the minds of European leaders that they have a formidable foe who's better not to antagonize and not to call his bluff by crossing red lines and sending troops on the ground officially into Ukraine.
Doctor, now continuing with France, it's a major NATO heavyweight. I just want you to, I'll allow me a minute plus just to put my point across here, because there are a number of things that have come to light in recent months, I would say, and then I want to come to my question. I essentially want to get your thoughts on the fact that is France out of line with other Western leaders? And I'll put my point across here. I want to highlight a few points. Macron was vocal about not getting sucked into US conflicts. Again, that's something we don't hear a lot of NATO nations saying. France has been circumventing Western sanctions on Russia as it continues to deal with Russian gas and energy. And this is since the first year of the war. France is turning abortion into a constitutional right. Recently, we just got that news today after the US Supreme Court in 2022 overturned the right to abortion. And they have mentioned the two aspects together. Now, France has a thriving defense industry of its own, with which it is taking away potential US orders as well. The French Rafale marine jets edged out the American FA-18 Super Hornets for India's naval fleet of jets. That's one case in point. France was also the first G7 leader calling for a ceasefire in Gaza, while US continues to avert calls for a permanent ceasefire till date. And as I mentioned earlier, seeing the way major NATO nations disagreed with Macron's statement suggesting the West may send troops to Ukraine, now, it begs the question, is France sticking out like a sore thumb in the NATO bloc?
Well, sore thumb, that is a subjective remark. France sticking out, of course, it has. Mr. Macron, from the first days of his presidency, and when he spoke before the joint house of Congress in the early months of his first presidency, he compared himself to de Gaulle, and he looked upon himself, or he wanted the world to see him, as the rightful heir to de Gaulle's heritage. Now, what was de Gaulle's heritage? Precisely sticking out like a sore thumb or sticking out. It is necessary to say that France is a NATO member with a unique situation. Ever since de Gaulle, France has not had NATO or American troops stationed on its soil. That is already a very big distinction from Germany and the other major NATO countries. That Mr. Macron would want to cultivate this tradition of being more perspective, having more of an analytical and independent view of the current world situation is understandable. Unfortunately, the man is extremely shallow, and he misjudged completely the thinking of his colleagues on this issue. The Germans were especially upset by his remarks because Mr. Scholz, despite his aggressive position with respect to the Ukraine war, does not want in any way to risk Germany being sucked into that war and facing missile strikes by Russia's hypersonic missiles that they have threatened to do. So France was caught unawares, even domestically in France. Mr. Macron was criticized heavily for this very big change in proposed change in national policy, which did not undergo anything resembling a national debate.
Doctor, I just want to take it a little further from there, and that'll be my final question to you for now, at least. You mentioned how Germany does not want to get sucked into the war. I want to understand from you, do you feel other European nations are in danger of getting sucked into the war, given the fact Russia is making gain after gain in Ukraine at the moment?
That is asking what you believe Russia's overall interests are.
That's my question to you.
Whether or not Russia intends to take more territory in other countries, for example, in the Baltics. That is being put out by the advocates of a stronger NATO, and it is a theory that has virtually no basis in fact. It is used as a propaganda point to strengthen the alliance and to give consolidation to the NATO policy positions. But it has no basis in fact. So Russia's intentions have been stated very clearly by Mr. Putin. It's the biggest country in the world. It does not need an additional centimeter of territory in Europe, and it doesn't want it. It's only the NATO leadership that wants to make this point in the hope of rallying the boys around a common policy of fighting Russia.
Right, that was International Affairs analyst Dr. Gilbert Doctorow joining us from Brussels. Always a pleasure speaking with you and getting your thoughts on trending matters, sir.
Thanks so much for having me.
Well, in other news now, in several NATO countries like the US, UK and Germany have ruled out deploying troops in Ukraine. This after the French President Emmanuel Macron on Tuesday said troops on the ground could not be ruled out.
No, the only U.S. military personnel that are in Ukraine are associated with the embassy as part of the Defense Attaché office, and they're doing important work in terms of helping us with the accountability of weapons and systems that are provided to Ukraine. The president's been clear there's not going to be U.S. troops on the ground in Ukraine.
And the NATO chief has denied any such move. However, he insisted that the military alliance will continue to support Ukraine. Kremlin has warned that conflict between Russia and the US-led NATO military alliance would become inevitable if European members send NATO troops to fight in Ukraine. Macron hinted at a possibility of sending troops to Ukraine at a meeting with European leaders in Paris, where countries discussed the formation of a new coalition to supply Ukraine with missiles and bombs of medium and long range.
La priorité des priorités est la question des munitions.
Everything was discussed in a free and direct manner tonight. There was no consensus today to send troops onto the ground in a manner that's official, assumed and endorsed. But on the dynamic, nothing should be excluded. We will do everything so that Russia cannot win this war.
Au bout des stocks qui sont encore disponibles, à identifier les pays.
Meanwhile, in Washington, the U.S. President Joe Biden held one of the most intense meetings in the Oval Office over aid to Ukraine that is facing an uphill task in the U.S. Congress. Biden has urged the lawmakers to approve the $95 billion package, which includes $60 billion for Ukraine. Ukraine is losing more territory on the battlefield. It has lost at least 3 major towns in the last fortnight. And for the very latest on this, our correspondent Tony Waterman is now joining us live from Paris. And Tony, well, sending troops to Ukraine would be a major escalation in this war, one fraught with danger, and the NATO seems to be realizing that, and of course also Macron's overstatement there.
Yeah, certainly these remarks that Macron made on Monday night have been swiftly rebuffed by a number of NATO countries, including Germany, Poland, the Czech Republic, Italy, the US, the UK. The list just goes on. And you're right. The reason that they did that is because if ground troops were sent into Russia, it would mark a major escalation in this war, and it would bring NATO into the conflict, direct conflict with Russia for the very first time. And Russia is, of course, a nuclear powerhouse, and it is not something that Europe in particular wants to wade into. Instead, NATO is saying that it wants to continue to focus on supplying Ukraine with support, whether that's financial support to help rebuild parts of the country that have been destroyed, or whether it's supplying military equipment, tanks, missiles, ammunition. Western allies had said that they were going to supply 1 million ammo rounds by March, which is just a couple of days away now. And Ukraine says that it has received less than 30% of that stockpile. So the focus really right now, according to NATO, is making sure that Ukraine is supplied militarily and not to send ground troops in any form into the country. In fact, Germany's deputy chancellor said that France should really be focusing more on offering weapons. Germany has been supplying a bulk of the weapons on the ground. And France has actually, despite being at the front of this push, has been quite stingy with what it's given to Ukraine so far, both in terms of financial support and military equipment. And so a little jab there between Germany and France. Macron's team did try to walk back these comments a bit, saying that he didn't intend for there to be ground troops on the front lines, but more perhaps sending in teams that would help produce ammunition on the ground or help demine certain areas, but not those types of troops that would actually be on the front lines of battle. But the reason why we had this mass summit, 21 heads of state on Monday, is because this war is now in its third year. We see these major cracks on the front lines in Ukraine.
Right.
They've been giving up certain territories. They're falling short when it comes to ammunition. So they're really trying to shore up support here in Europe.
Well, absolutely. Tony, thanks very much indeed for joining us with the very latest there with the NATO's thinking on the Ukraine war.
Infamous Kremlin critic and Russian opposition leader Alexei Navalny will be buried on the 1st of March. A funeral service will be held in Moscow.
Now, funeral service will also be held in the Mariano district, and there is not much that's known about the funeral, whether it will be open or if it will be a private affair. That remains to be seen. Navalny died on the 16th of February in a prison in Siberia, where he was being held in harsh conditions on a lengthy prison sentence. There are very few details that have been released around his sudden death. Russian authorities initially refused to hand Navalny's body over to his mother as well, but finally relented 8 days after his death.
Earlier today, speaking at the European Parliament, Navalny's wife, Yulia Navalny, accused Moscow of abusing her dead husband's body. She also cited fears that Kremlin will try to cause disruption and arrest people at her husband's funeral.
Thank you. I'm not sure yet whether it will be peaceful or whether police will arrest those who have come to say goodbye to my husband.
Navalny called on European leaders to fight what she called Putin's criminal gang. Navalny's emotional speech received a standing ovation from European parliamentarians.
Now, there has been controversy surrounding Navalny's funeral since the day his body was released. On Tuesday, Navalny's spokeswoman Kira Yarmish said his team was struggling to find somewhere to hold the ceremony. Some funeral homes had claimed that they were fully booked, while others had refused when they found out who the event was for.
Almost 2 weeks since his death, tributes continue to pour in for Alexei Navalny. From world leaders to the Russian population, they've been paying their respects to the opposition leader.
A Russian rights monitor has said that over 400 people have been arrested in more than 30 cities across Russia after laying flowers for Navalny.
Alexei Navalny rose to prominence through his anti-corruption campaigning. He exposed what he called rampant corruption at the top of Putin's administration. He was arrested in January 2021. That was on his return to Russia after being treated in Germany for a poisoning attack. Moving on now, in a critical development in the ongoing Russia-Ukraine war, for the first time Russian forces have destroyed a US-made Abrams tank, and they did so by using the Piranha 10, or as they call it, the Piranha 10 drone. The development underscores a significant shift in the dynamics of drone warfare. It is also likely to have an impact on conventional armored units. Let's find out more about Russia's Piranha 10 drone first. Developed by the Simbursk Design Bureau in Ulyanovsk city, the Piranha drone has been a subject of interest owing to its unique capabilities. This carbon fiber polymer, reinforced polymer, constructed drone has a maximum range of 15 kilometers and a maximum carrying capacity of 4.5 kilograms. Piranha 10 quadcopter can carry a multitude of payloads. It can deliver the tandem cumulative warhead of the reactive grenade P7-7VR summary at a range of 8 to 10 kilometers. Meanwhile, the Piranha 10 is also capable of delivering the lighter monoblock cumulative grenades PG-7VL at 12 to 15 kilometers. And according to its manufacturers, the drone operates on unique frequencies, making the drone almost invulnerable to enemy electronic warfare. Being a first-person view kamikaze drone, Piranha 10 is outfitted with a camera that transmits video feed wirelessly to a mobile device, headgear, headset or another device. Not only this, the operator in fact can also acquire images or videos of the environment from the drone's point of view. And in addition to carrying light and armored vehicles, the UAV can also destroy dugouts, shelters and fortifications. Other Russian drones used successfully in the zone of special operations are the Lancet, the Anacondas and the Orlan.
The United States and its NATO allies have ruled out sending troops into Ukraine. And this comes after French President Emmanuel Macron said that sending troops to Ukraine cannot be ruled out completely. The United States, which is Ukraine's biggest backer in this war against Russia, has said that it has no plans on sending ground troops to fight in Ukraine against the Russians. Listen in.
No, the only U.S. Military personnel that are in Ukraine are associated with the embassy as part of the Defense Attaché office, and they're doing important work in terms of helping us with the accountability of weapons and systems that are provided to Ukraine. The president's been clear there's not going to be U.S. troops on the ground in Ukraine.
Now, NATO allies like Germany, the United Kingdom and Italy have also said that there is no change to the agreed position, that no European nation or NATO member state will send troops to Ukraine. Now, NATO's chief Jens Stoltenberg has also denied considering sending troops to Ukraine. However, Stoltenberg has insisted that the military alliance will continue to support Ukraine. The Kremlin has also warned that conflict between Russia and the US-led NATO military alliance would actually become inevitable if European members of the NATO troops continue with their fight in Ukraine. Earlier, Macron had hinted at the possibility of sending troops to Ukraine. This after a meeting with European leaders in Paris that aimed to send Moscow a pretty strong message of Western resolve over support for Kyiv. The leaders in Paris also discussed the formation of a new coalition to supply Ukraine with missiles and bombs of medium and long range.
La priorité des priorités est la question des munitions.
Everything was discussed in a free and direct manner tonight. There was no consensus today to send troops onto the ground in a manner that's official, assumed and endorsed. But on the dynamic, nothing should be excluded. We will do everything so that Russia cannot win this war.
Aller au bout des stocks qui sont encore disponibles, à identifier les pays.
Meanwhile, in Washington, the US President Joe Biden held one of the most intense meetings in the Oval Office. Well, that's of course according to the Senate Democrat Majority Leader Chuck Schumer. The meeting was over the crucial Ukraine aid that is now facing an uphill task in the US Congress. Biden has urged the lawmakers to approve the $95 billion package, which includes $60 billion for Ukraine. On the other hand, while diplomacy talks are on, Ukraine is also losing more territory on the battlefield. In the latest, Ukraine's military has said that its forces have withdrawn from 2 more villages near the eastern town of Avdiivka. However, Ukraine has said that Russia has witnessed some significant losses in the fight for the villages. Now, earlier in the month, Russian forces captured the strategic town.
South Korea's defense chief is making startling claims about the nature of relations between North Korea and Russia. The defense chief Shin Won-sik says that over the past 6 months, North Korea has supplied Russia with a staggering 6,700 shipping containers of artillery shells. In exchange, Russia has reportedly given North Korea about 10,000 shipping containers of food and essentials. The South Korean minister further alleged that North Korean military factories are producing arms for Russia. Shin Won-sik said about 30% of Russia is going into North Korea. This includes material necessary to manufacture weapons for Russia. According to reports, North Korea is seeking Russian aircraft technology, ground maneuvering equipment, and other essential elements. The South Korean military is actively investigating the extent of the military cooperation that includes transfer of Russian technology. There are also concerns about North Korea's intensive development of cruise missiles. South Korea has pointed out that the cruise missiles, unlike ballistic missiles, do not violate United Nations Security Council resolutions. But since they are capable of carrying nuclear warheads, North Korea's focus on cruise missiles serves both an export purpose to Russia and its own frontline needs.
Now, in its 2-year war against Ukraine, Russia seems to have a secret arms supplier. Now, reports in fact say that North Korea is making short-range ballistic missiles that Russia is firing at the Ukrainian targets. Reports also indicate that this was suggested by evidence of North Korean markings on ammunition that has been fired by Russia in recent days. However, it is not clear as to just how much ammunition